Mornings in Ichenwald always held a strange mixture of peace and solitude, especially in autumn, when mist still clung to pine branches and the forest floor was soaked in the earthy scent of damp soil. The first flicker of light each day came from the little wooden cabin at the edge of town, Agnes Parker's home. The woman just past 60 lived alone with her grandson Eli, 5 years old, ever since that fateful day when a runaway truck took the life of her only son Eli's father. Death came quickly, too quickly, just another rainy afternoon. The police knocked on the door holding a worn wallet and a crumpled piece of water-stained paperwork. They didn't have to say much, didn't need to. Agnes understood everything in the young officer's bowed head. From that moment, silence fell over the house like a heavy curtain. But no one expected Eli, a boy once known for his constant chatter, endless questions and laughter, to fall completely, utterly silent. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't ask where his father was. He simply stood there clutching a tattered teddy bear named Mr. Paws, his third birthday gift from his father, and slowly sat down on the rug staring into nothing. At first, Agnes thought it was shock. She assumed he would eventually break down, cry, beg to see his dad like any child would. But a week passed, then 2, then 3. Eli said nothing, not a word. Doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological reaction in children exposed to extreme trauma. He hasn't lost the ability to speak, they explained. His mind has simply locked that function as a way to protect itself. But that explanation didn't ease Agnes's pain, because every morning she woke up to find Eli sitting silently by the window, his eyes void of life, fixed on the edge of the forest where he and his father once went fishing every Sunday. The town of Ichenwald was so small that no grocery store stayed open past 5 p.m., and there was no kindergarten close enough for Eli to attend. Agnes was used to the quiet of country life, but never to the quiet of a child. A silence so thick it was terrifying. On some nights, she would wake in the middle of a dream to find his bedroom light still on. She'd enter and find him not crying, not panicking, just sitting there, wrapped in a blanket, gripping Mr. Paws as if waiting for something that would never return. She tried taking him to therapists, but he only shook his head and stared into the distance as though he lived in another world adults couldn't touch. She tried everything: fairy tales, homemade cookies, cartoons he used to love watching with his dad. None of it worked. If anything, he withdrew further into himself. Time crawled by as if being dragged by a rusty chain. The cracks in Eli's soul weren't visible, but Agnes felt them every time he silently placed his hand on the old photo of his father. The room that had once belonged to her son had become a time capsule, a sacred space filled with things no one dared touch. Agnes herself hadn't entered it since the funeral. But Eli did, quietly, secretly. She'd caught him once standing in front of the wardrobe, pressing his face into an old shirt as if trying to absorb its fading warmth. When she found him there, he didn't flinch. He simply lowered his head and walked back to his room, wordless. Agnes began keeping a journal. Not about herself, but about Eli. She documented every small flicker of change, a slight nod, a puzzled look when she burned the pancakes, or an unexpected hand squeeze while crossing the old wooden bridge where his father once carried him on his shoulders. Each tiny moment she recorded. Each was a spark of hope. Once she heard a dog howling in the distance, carried through the night wind. Eli flinched. He looked toward the sound, then instinctively placed a hand on his chest where Mr. Paws always rested. It was then Agnes realized Eli hadn't lost his emotions. They were just too big, too painful, too overwhelming for a 5-year-old to put into words. There was one thought Agnes never spoke aloud, but it haunted her every day. She feared Eli would never speak again. Because when a child no longer laughs, no longer talks, their world shrinks like a room with no windows. Agnes, with her calloused hands and tired eyes, began to pray. Not for miracles, just once, to hear Eli call her Nana again. Like he used to when he scraped a knee or when he wanted one more cookie before bed. Then one morning, while the first golden light filtered through the cabin's warped window panes, Eli stood up from the breakfast table, tugged on her sleeve, and pointed out toward the edge of the woods. No words, no explanations, just a gesture and a look of quiet determination. "You want to go outside?" Agnes asked, barely believing her own voice. Eli nodded. It was the first time in over 3 months that Eli had asked for anything. And in that tiny nod, a sliver of light pierced through the long darknesses that had wrapped around their lives. Agnes sprang to her feet, pulled on her coat, and took the small hand that trembled in her own. She didn't know what waited for them beyond the forest path, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the first time Eli wanted to return to the place he and his father once called their treasure spot. And sometimes healing doesn't begin with laughter. Sometimes it begins with a single step and a pair of eyes looking back toward the river. That morning, the sun rose slowly, as if it too were hesitant. The first rays of light filtered through the pine trees and landed on the mist-covered grass around Agnes's cabin, casting golden streaks like a dream gently unraveling. Agnes held Eli's small hand tightly as the two of them turned onto the narrow path that led to the Schwarzwasser River, an old trail Eli had once known by heart when he used to walk it with his father. It had been a long time since his little feet had touched this ground. She didn't ask why he wanted to go to the river that day. She was afraid that if she spoke, he would retreat again into his silent shell. So she walked beside him quietly, her eyes fixed on the small boy moving slowly ahead, as if retracing steps from a memory long buried. The air was cool and crisp. The scent of young pine needles and damp earth swirled together on the breeze. Dry leaves fluttered down across their path. Agnes noticed that Eli was starting to walk faster. His little legs moved as if drawn forward by something unseen, a quiet call only he could hear. When the river finally came into view, she felt Eli squeeze her hand. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lit up, not with joy, but with alertness. Something was wrong. Agnes opened her mouth to call out, to ask him to wait, so she could check ahead first, but suddenly a low, drawn-out moan echoed from the water's edge. It wasn't a human sound. It was hoarse-broken, strangled in the throat like a sob being swallowed. Eli froze. He turned to look at his grandmother, an urgent look, pleading and determined. Then, without waiting for her response, the boy broke into a run, darting straight toward the sound, pushing through tall weeds and wild grass lining the riverbank. "Eli, stop! It's dangerous!" Agnes shouted, her voice trembling with fear. But Eli didn't stop, or perhaps he couldn't. Because as he reached the river's edge, a terrifying scene unfolded before his eyes. In the middle of the churning, muddy current was a large black German shepherd, soaking wet mouth agape with foamy breath, eyes wild and desperate as they searched the bank for help. Its front legs flailed in panic. A rusted chain was wrapped tightly around one of its hind legs, caught on a submerged branch, dragging it down with every wave. The dog was drowning. Agnes tripped as she tried to run after him, her knees slamming into the ground, but it was too late. She could only watch as her 5-year-old grandson, who hadn't spoken in months, leapt into the river without a sound. She screamed. Eli. The Schwarzwasser River was usually gentle, but after the heavy rain the night before, the water had risen and the current was stronger than usual. Agnes's heart nearly stopped as she saw Eli wade into the torrent, the water climbing up to his chest. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't afraid. He swam straight for the drowning dog. Agnes crawled toward the edge, her hands shaking, calling his name over and over again. Terror gripped her, not just because of the river, but because of the look in Eli's eyes, not that of a frightened child, but of a small soul willing to fight for another's life. The dog thrashed for a moment longer, then began to weaken. Its eyes glazed and its head drooped toward the water. Eli surged forward, grabbing hold of the dog's collar with both tiny hands. He pulled back with all the strength his small body could muster, desperately trying to keep the animal's head above the surface. Agnes screamed again, "Hold on, I'm here!" She slid down the bank, grabbing Eli's leg and pulling with every ounce of strength her aging body had left. The mud was slick, the water clawed at them, but between them, between a terrified grandmother and a boy who'd been silent far too long, an unspoken bond held strong. Inch by inch, she dragged them both back to safety. Finally, all three collapsed onto the muddy ground. Agnes gasped for breath, her body shaking. Eli was soaked cold and covered in mud, but still clung tightly to the dog, his face buried in its wet fur, unwilling to let go. The dog choked and coughed, then began breathing heavily. Its eyes opened again, and this time there was no panic. They locked with Eli's, and something passed between them. Something wordless. Something that said, "You saved me." Agnes saw it, felt it, and in that moment she understood something deeper than words could ever express. Two broken beings had found each other. They sat on the riverbank for a long while. No one spoke. There was only the sound of ragged breathing, the distant rush of rain, and Agnes's heartbeat pounding in her chest. When she finally reached out to wipe the mud from Eli's face, he still didn't let go of the dog. His arms were wrapped around it like he feared that if he loosened his grip, it might vanish just like his father had vanished in the storm weeks before. Agnes whispered, "We have to take it home." Eli didn't answer. But when she stood, he stood too, his hand still clutching the dog's collar. On the way back, Agnes kept glancing behind her. The black dog, soaked and limping, stayed right beside Eli. It didn't stray, not even once. Despite its injuries, it turned its head to check on the boy whenever he paused, as if to make sure its rescuer was still there. Agnes noticed the dog had no collar, no tag, no signs of ownership. Only that rusted chain still hanging from its leg and long, deep wounds along its hips and shoulders. Something was terribly wrong. Back at the house, Agnes laid out a thick towel on the kitchen floor and gently guided the dog to lie down. It whimpered softly but didn't resist. Eli knelt beside it, his tiny hands brushing away chunks of mud and debris caught in its matted fur. His movements were slow, careful, like someone performing a ritual he somehow already knew. Agnes didn't speak. She just stood there and wept. Not only because Eli had acted with such courage, but because for the first time in months, she saw life return to her grandson's eyes. The rain came without warning. Just as Agnes closed the gate behind her, the first frost droplets began to fall onto the porch roof, soft and scattered, like the sky knocking politely. Within minutes, the hush turned into a roar. Wind lashed the trees and thunder split the sky like cannon fire. Eli didn't say a word. He simply pulled the largest towel from the linen drawer, laid it gently across the wooden floor near the kitchen, and knelt beside the dog. His small hands trembled, whether from the pain or from the wave of emotions still lingering. Agnes couldn't tell. She brought out warm water, soaking a cloth and gently wiping away the mud clinging to the animal's back and neck. Eli, meanwhile, stared intently at every wound as if he were reading a silent language. Every scratch, every gash, every bruise telling a piece of a hidden story. The dog didn't whimper. It didn't howl, didn't resist. It just lay there breathing heavily, eyes half closed. But every time Eli touched it, its tail gave a faint thump against the wooden floor, a soft knock of trust. Agnes felt something odd. Despite the pain, despite its injuries, the dog wasn't afraid of people, or at least not of Eli. There was something between them already, something deep, something neither of them could explain. The wind hissed through the cracks in the window panes. Outside, the trees groaned and swayed as the rain hammered the roof like a war drum. The kitchen glowed with the warm yellow light of a single lamp, but the air inside was stretched tight with tension. Agnes knelt beside the dog and examined a long tear on its back leg. The wound was open deep as straight and clean as if it had been made with a blade, and clearly not an accident. "Oh dear God," she whispered, her fingers shaking as she peeled back blood-matted fur. "Who did this to you?" Eli looked up. His eyes met hers. He said nothing, but in those wide, silent eyes was a quiet storm. Not anger at any one person, but a grief and rage against a kind of cruelty he was still too young to name. Agnes went to fetch the phone, her heart pounding. She called the only person she trusted for this, Dr. Lennox, the old village veterinarian, and an old friend from her younger days. He was the only one who might know what to do. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said. "Rain or no rain, don't let the dog fall asleep. Keep it warm, and if you can, give it a name." When Agnes returned to the living room, she paused. Eli had pulled a thick wool blanket over both himself and the dog. He was sitting still, cross-legged, one hand resting gently on the animal's neck, his eyes distant, not blank but thoughtful in a way far older than 5 years should allow. "Do you want to name it?" Agnes asked softly. Eli looked down at the dog. After a moment, his lips moved, not loud enough to speak, but enough for her to see. Then unexpectedly, he placed a small hand over his chest, gave it a gentle pat, and reached out to rest his palm on the dog's head. "She said, name it," Agnes repeated in a near whisper. "What name suits a warrior like this one?" Eli turned his eyes to the window where lightning carved wild patterns across the sky, then looked back at her, his gaze bright with purpose. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew. "Max!" Agnes let out a short laugh, a breathy sound so light she didn't even realize it was laughter at first. It had been so long since she'd heard it come from herself. "Max," she echoed, "a strong name, just like the way you pulled him back from the jaws of death." Eli didn't smile, but the corner of his lips twitched just barely, like a blossom trying to open for the first time in months. Max let out a soft sound, almost singing, and his tail gave a faint, deliberate thump on the floor, as if he understood, as if he knew he had a name now, a beginning, a family. When Lennox arrived, rain dripping from the brim of his wide-brimmed hat and the shoulders of his coat, he carried a soaked umbrella in one hand and a worn medical case in the other. He didn't speak right away when he stepped inside. He just looked first at Eli, who sat beside Max like a sentinel, then at Max himself, wrapped in a blanket and breathing shallowly. Lennox's expression softened. "Well," he said as he knelt down and opened his kit, "looks like we've got ourselves a real fighter here." He glanced at Agnes. She smiled gently, her eyes still on her grandson. "2 of them," she replied. "We've got 2. The rain lasted all night. Agnes couldn't sleep. She lay in the old armchair by the fireplace, eyes fixed on Eli. Her small grandson curled up beside Max on a thick blanket. Both were soaked. Both were exhausted. Yet neither would leave the other. Max, though in pain, tried to wag his tail every time Eli shifted. And Eli, the boy who hadn't spoken a single word in months, cared for Max with a strange kind of patience, delicate, steady, almost as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Lennox had stitched the long gash on Max's leg, bandaged the bruises, and administered antibiotics and painkillers. He didn't speak much during the examination, but the look in his aged eyes said it all. Max had lived through hell. Someone kept him chained up for weeks, maybe months, Lennox said quietly to Agnes when Eli wasn't listening. "His ribs are sticking out, bruises everywhere, patches of fur missing. I'm sure he was beaten repeatedly. And he didn't end up in that river by accident." Agnes nodded slowly, her hands clenched. "So someone tried to let him die. And Eli didn't let that happen," Lennox said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That little boy did something most grown-ups wouldn't dare." In the small wooden house in Eichenwald, time seemed to move differently in the days that followed. Agnes no longer called Eli to meals. She didn't insist he bathe or practice reading. She let him step out from under the weight of grief in his own way. And that way, without question, was Max. Each morning, Eli would sit beside Max, holding a tiny warm cloth and gently wiping the dried blood from around his ears and neck. He would change Max's water bowl himself, pick up clumps of loose fur from the floor, and whenever Max whimpered in pain, Eli would rest his hand softly on the dog's nose as if to say, "I'm here, it's okay now." Max never took his eyes off Eli. Even while asleep, his ears perked up whenever the boy moved. Between the two of them, a bond had formed, one built on pure trust with no need for words. Agnes began journaling again. Day 2, Eli fed Max boiled meat with his own hands, refused to let anyone else touch it. Day 3, Eli giggled quietly when Max sneezed in his face. Day 4, Eli fell asleep while gently stroking Max's head. Both of them breathing in sync like children who had survived a war. Then came Day 7. That morning, sunlight slipped through the window blinds, scattering warm streaks across the wooden floor like drops of honey. Agnes was at the stove preparing to warm Max's broth. Eli sat beside the dog, gently rubbing the bandaged joints. Max let out a soft whimper, a small, familiar moan of pain. Eli tilted his head. His hands paused. He looked directly into Max's eyes, and then quietly, almost inaudibly, he opened his mouth. "Friend." Agnes dropped the spoon into the pot. It clanged sharply against the edge. She turned around, eyes wide in disbelief. Eli was still looking at Max, lips barely moving, as if afraid the wind might carry the word away. "Friend." Agnes couldn't speak. She simply stood there, one hand over her mouth, heart pounding wildly. For the first time in nearly 4 months, Eli had spoken. One word, but it was a word that carried his entire soul. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He was focused on Max, and Max, with the uncanny instinct of a dog who understood the unsaid, wagged his tail so hard it loosened the bandage. Agnes burst into tears, but not the tears of sorrow, tears of release, of healing, of hope. From that moment on, something had changed. Eli didn't suddenly start talking again. He still stayed quiet most of the time. But now when Max barked, Eli would murmur something back. When Agnes asked a question, he would nod, and sometimes respond with a word yes. More. Water. Good boy. And every time Eli spoke, Max would wag his tail even harder, nuzzle into his palm as if cheering him on in his own quiet way. Agnes began to believe something profound. Max wasn't just the dog Eli saved. He was the one who pulled Eli out of the abyss of silence. One afternoon, while the two of them sat by the window nibbling on bread, Agnes gently asked, "Do you love Max, sweetheart?" Eli nodded. "Do you want Max to stay here forever?" He nodded again, this time more firmly. Then after a small pause, he spoke again, his voice soft but certain. "Family." Agnes didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat tightened. Because in just over a week, a dog who had been chained, beaten, and thrown into a river, and a boy who hadn't spoken a word in months had pulled each other back into the light, not with therapy, not with force, but with presence, a gentle hand on tangled fur, and a look that asked for nothing in return. Max didn't need Eli to say 100 words. He just needed a touch, a hug, and a silence that no longer hurt. And Eli, he didn't need lessons. He just needed a friend. That morning, there were no birds singing. Agnes had just finished washing the dishes when a loud knock echoed through the cabin, firm, urgent, and unmistakably aggressive. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron, heart sinking with unease as she walked to the door. Standing on the porch was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered leather coat, muddy boots, and eyes like cold slabs of stone. In his hand, he held up a faded photograph. In the photo, Max thin and chained tightly to a wooden post. "That dog is mine," he said flatly. "It ran away. I've come to take it back." Agnes stiffened. Who sent you, my friend?" "I'm Grady Rankin," he replied, not bothering to hide the disdain in his voice. "And I have the paperwork." Agnes said nothing. She instinctively stepped back just as Max appeared in the kitchen doorway, with ears perked up, eyes shifting from curiosity to tension. In that moment, his entire body went rigid. Then he backed up and let out a low rumbling growl, not feral, but a clear warning. Eli came running in right after, and the moment he saw Grady, he froze. The boy flung his arms around Max's neck, eyes wide with fear. The scene, the trembling child, the growling bone, and the smug man standing in the doorway looked like a portrait of absolute contrast. Agnes, somehow steadier than she expected, said, "If you truly were Max's previous owner, you might want to explain why the dog is reacting like it's about to be beaten again." Grady shrugged. "It's a guard dog, not a pet to cuddle. No one chains a guard dog so tightly that its ribs show and its skin turns black and blue," she replied coldly. He clenched his fists. "I've got a bill of sale. You're keeping stolen property." Agnes stood tall. "Then I suggest you come back with the sheriff and a lawyer." And she slammed the door shut. 10 minutes later, Sheriff Davis arrived. He was a man with silvering hair, a calm baritone voice, and the kind of steady presence that made Agnes trust him completely. Grady was still pacing near the front gate, puffing on a cigarette as if he were the victim. When he saw the sheriff, he immediately thrust out a crumpled paper, an old bill of sale handwritten and signed by a dog breeder that had shut down 3 years ago. "Max is my property," he insisted. "They're keeping him illegally." Sheriff Davis looked at the document, then over at Max, who was now standing in the doorway staring unblinkingly at Grady. His body pressed protectively against Eli's legs. "There's something off here," the sheriff muttered. After a round of questions, Davis made a decision. "Until we complete an investigation, the dog stays here," he said. "It's clear he fears you." And the boy, Eli, his reaction was equally telling. Grady protested furiously, threatening lawsuits and shouting obscenities. But in the end, he stormed off, kicking gravel in his wake. Only when his truck disappeared down the road did Max let out a soft whimper and collapse at Eli's feet, resting his head on the boy's lap. Eli didn't speak. He just ran his hand through Max's fur again and again, part comfort, part reassurance, and part desperation to keep Max there close, safe. But Sheriff Davis didn't stop there. Relying on years of experience and gut instinct, he knew Grady's story didn't add up. Too many holes, too much aggression, and most of all, too much fear for Max. "Has the dog ever led you to where he might have lived before?" Davis asked. Agnes thought for a moment. "No, but every time we pass the old trail by the Western River, Ben Max always stops. Stares for a long time." Davis nodded. "Then tomorrow morning I'll come back. If Max is willing, we'll follow him." The next morning, Agnes pulled on her tall rubber boots, holding Eli's hand tightly, while Sheriff Davis carried a walking stick. Max, as if sensing what was about to unfold, stood waiting by the gate, alert and ready. They followed the familiar dirt path covered in fallen leaves, heading west toward the narrowing riverbanks and the edge of the deep woods. Max took the lead. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He just walked, determined, purposeful, through thorny undergrowth, over slick earth, until they arrived at a cluster of abandoned kennels hidden beneath waist-high weeds. The gate was broken in two. Rusted iron chains still hung from a splintered post. The ground was marked with circular depressions where dogs had clearly been chained for long stretches. The stench of rot lingered. A collapsed wooden structure nearby was smeared with faded dried blood. Sheriff Davis crouched down and picked up a strip of barbed cord, the kind used in animal cruelty cases he'd only seen back in his old precinct. Agnes turned away, unable to look. Eli clung to Max tightly. "We'll need to bring in a proper team," Davis said grimly. "But this is more than enough to begin." He looked at Max, now standing tall, eyes glowing not with fear, but with the defiance of someone reclaiming justice. "The boy and this dog have already given us the truth," the sheriff said, gripping his notepad tightly, "and I won't let anyone take him away again." That night, Agnes placed Max by the fire, his head resting on Eli's lap. There was nothing left to say. Because in her heart, Agnes knew the battle wasn't won with legal papers or loud words. It had been won with courage, with a bond formed between two lost souls who found each other in the dark. Eli looked at Max, then at her, and for the first time he smiled, a real smile. A week had passed since their journey to the abandoned kennel. Sheriff Davis returned to Agnes's house with a stack of files in hand and a more relaxed look on his face. The police had begun collecting evidence and were planning a deeper investigation. Grady Rankin had yet to show up again. Perhaps he had sensed danger in the air, realizing his time in that quiet town was running out. Agnes felt some relief, but not enough to rest easy, because Max and Eli were still walking the fragile edge between trauma and healing. Physical wounds would fade, but the scars inside, those would need time and love. One morning, Max started eating less. Agnes noticed that her belly seemed a little round. At first, she thought it might just be a full stomach or a reaction to the antibiotics. But by the third day, when Max began to vomit slightly, Agnes could no longer sit still. "We should take Max to see Lennox," she said to Eli, who was quietly sketching something near the window. The boy looked up and nodded, no hesitation. At the little village clinic, Lennox slipped on his glasses, running a gentle hand across Max's lower belly, his eyes focused as though reading an ancient book. Agnes sat beside him, fingers interlocked tightly. Eli stood a step away, silent, his gaze never once leaving Max. After a long pause, Lennox finally looked up. "Well," he said with a small smile. He glanced at the two sitting across from him. "Max is actually Maxine," he chuckled, "and she's expecting, about 6 weeks along." Agnes was too surprised to speak. Eli looked at her, then at Lennox, then down at Max, his face unsure whether to believe what he'd just heard. "She survived everything," Lennox said, still gently stroking the soft fur of her belly. "And now she carries a piece of the future. It's a miracle." On the drive home, the car rolled slower than usual. A cool breeze passed in through the slightly opened window. Eli rested one hand on Max's back, the other wrapped around Mr. Paws. He didn't speak, but when Agnes glanced sideways, she saw a tiny smile on his lips, tender, careful, like he was holding something precious inside. That evening, Agnes carefully laid a thick pad by the hearth, Max's usual spot. She lit a soft-scented candle, pulled the curtains open to let the moonlight in, and placed a fresh bowl of water and a clean cloth beside her. Eli brought out an old picture book, the one his father used to read to him every night, and sat beside Max. He opened the book and turned the pages as if reading it aloud to both of them. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Once upon a time." Agnes heard it from the kitchen, and her heart shattered wide open with emotion. From that night on, Eli read to Max every evening. Fairy tales, stories of knights-saving princesses, of talking animals, and magical lands where sadness could be healed with a hug. Max would lie still, her eyes half closed. But every time Eli laid his hand on her belly, she would sigh gently, sometimes even shifting slightly, as if responding to his soft, steady presence. Agnes no longer found it strange when she caught Eli murmuring tiny stories to Max when he thought she wasn't listening. She saw him place his small hand over Max's warm belly, waiting patiently for the slightest kick from the growing pups, like someone feeling a miracle too big for words. One morning while Agnes was cooking, Eli came and tugged gently at her sleeve. "Grandma," he said. She turned startled. Not because he spoke, he'd been speaking more and more lately, but because of how he said it clearly without hesitation, his eyes lit with excitement. "Grandma, I felt a kick," he whispered, tugging her toward the living room. "In Max's tummy." Agnes followed. Eli knelt beside Max and guided her hand to the rise of the dog's belly. And then, just like that, Agnes felt it too. A faint thump, a stir of life. "They're coming soon, right?" Eli asked. Agnes nodded, her eyes misting. From that day on, Eli began naming every kick he felt. "The big, strong one, that's Thunder," he laughed. "The soft, fluttery one is Pebble. And the one that's always curled closest to Max, that's Moon." Agnes didn't stop him. She let him imagine, let him give names to those tiny heartbeats, as if building a bridge from his past to his future. Max began to grow stronger too. Her coat became shinier, her wounds closed, and her eyes, they softened. They no longer darted nervously or hid behind fear. She was no longer a frightened animal. She was a mother, preparing for her babies. One cold evening at the start of winter, Agnes found Eli drawing. "What are you sketching, sweetheart?" she asked. Eli tilted his head and smiled. "I'm drawing our home, with Max, with you, with me, and the puppies, too." Agnes leaned in to take a closer look. In the childlike lines of his drawing was a small cabin in the woods, sunlight pouring through the window. A white-haired old woman, a boy hugging a teddy bear, and beside him a large dog lying with a round belly, surrounded by tiny puppies like little balls of fluff. At the very top of the page, Eli had written one word in careful, uneven letters: home. That night, the rain wasn't as fierce as previous storms, but it was long and strangely cold. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window, slipping through every wooden seam, making Agnes's little cottage shiver. She woke to an unfamiliar sound, not loud but irregular and urgent. Pulling a shawl over her shoulders, she stepped out of bed and headed for the living room where Max was resting on her familiar blanket by the fire. The moment Agnes saw her, she froze. In the soft glow of the table lamp, Max was panting heavily, her body tense, her eyes filled with pain, but clarity too. Fresh blood had begun to soak through the thin cloth beneath her. No explanation was needed. Agnes understood immediately the time had come. She called out loud and sharp, "Eli! Eli, wake up!" Within seconds, the boy came running, hair tousled, still clutching Mr. Paws. "Max?" he asked, voice trembling. Agnes nodded. "Max is having her puppies. We need to help her." Eli didn't ask questions. He simply knelt beside Max, gently stroked her forehead, and whispered softly, "You're strong. You can do this." All through the night, grandmother and grandson took turns wiping her, keeping her warm, whispering encouragement. At around 2 a.m., with rain drumming softly on the roof, the first puppy was born. Eli held his breath at the tiny sound, a high-pitched squeal, wet and fragile, yet bursting with life. He gasped and said, "Nova, her name is Nova." Agnes smiled, "Because she's the first star of the night." Then came the second pup, darker in color, ears flopped down tightly against her head. "Scout?" Eli whispered, "because she looks like she wants to explore." Then came Luna, the smallest of them all, with a white streak down her nose like moonlight. And finally the fourth, the biggest, the heaviest, and the most special, pitch black fur, just like Max, except for a single white mark on his chest, just like the first time Eli had seen her, gasping in the floodwater. "Max Jr.," Eli said, hugging the pup gently to his chest. By sunrise, the 4 newborns were nestled against Max's belly, nursing for the first time. Eli sat beside them, both hands cupped protectively around their tiny bodies, as if afraid even the morning breeze might be too cold for them. Agnes poured herself a warm cup of tea and watched her grandson. There was no more fear in Eli's eyes. Only love, a love so profound it caught in her throat. In the week that followed, the little house was alive with sound, high-pitched yips, the scratch of tiny claws on wood, hungry whimpers, and Eli's laughter. He gave each puppy a name, tied a different colored ribbon around their necks, sewed a new blanket for their bed by hand, and every night he read fairy tales aloud. Now not just for Max, but for Nova Scout, Luna, and Max Jr. too. Agnes realized something through all the months of loss and silence. Eli had never felt like he mattered. But now he was the center of an entire universe, a small, warm world where little hearts beat in time with his. 1 week later, Sheriff Davis returned not with forms or questions, but with a bag of puppy kibble and a quiet smile. "I've got news," he said as he stepped inside. "Grady Rankin has left the state, abandoned his property. No forwarding address." Agnes raised an eyebrow. "So that means..." "That means," Davis nodded. "Legally, Max and the pups are yours. There's no one left to challenge it. All the medical records, injury reports, and your statements have been submitted to the court." "Congratulations, this family is official." Agnes let out a long breath, eyes misting. Eli, cradling Luna in his arms, looked back and asked in a small voice, "He's not coming back, is he?" Davis looked at the boy, then at Max, who had instinctively stepped in front of Eli, standing protectively, and shook his head. "If he ever does," the sheriff said with a grin, "you'll be the first person he's afraid of. Not because you're scary, but because you're brave." That night, Eli pulled the blanket tighter around the puppies. Max lay beside them, breathing slow and deep, her eyes glowing in the firelight. Agnes stood at the doorway, one hand over her heart. For the first time in years, she felt completely light. From the darkness, they had made a family not perfect, not polished, but real. A family not born of blood, but of trust, of redemption, and of the quiet, unconditional love between a child and a wounded soul. Eli set Mr. Orbam, paused aside, then gently pulled Max Jr. against his chest. "Our family's really big now, huh, Max?" he whispered. Max lowered her head onto his hand, and in reply her long tail thumped softly, a warm, steady beat. Spring returned to Ekenwald slowly and gently. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing soft green grass stretching along the banks of the Schwarzwasser River. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of damp earth, wildflowers, and new pine resin, awakening from its long winter slumber. In the small wooden house at the edge of the forest, life buzzed more joyfully than ever. The yips of puppies, the scratch of tiny claws, the sound of Eli reading aloud to Max Jr. All of it blended into a warm, quiet symphony, like sunlight streaming through the old wooden window panes at dusk. Max had made a full recovery. Her black fur was glossy once more, covering the once thin frame. The deep wounds that had scarred her body were now faint, barely visible beneath her thick coat, like painful memories that time couldn't erase, but love had taught not to bleed. Eli was growing not in size, but in spirit. His eyes no longer held the fog of sorrow they once did. Now they glowed bright and alive, like a silent fire that had finally been lit. He spoke more now, not as much as other children, but every word he did speak carried confidence, warmth, and honesty. One morning, as Agnes was preparing breakfast, Eli ran into the kitchen, his hair messy, his cheeks red with excitement. "Grandma," he said, "it's such a beautiful day. Can we go to the river?" Agnes paused. A simple question, but it struck her heart in the most unexpected way. The Schwarzwasser River, where everything had begun. "Yes," she replied with a gentle smile. "I'll pack the picnic. You go get Max and Max Jr., okay?" Eli nodded and ran off like a gust of wind. Moments later, his joyful voice rang out from the yard. "Max, Max Jr., let's go." They walked the old path that led to the river, the same trail Eli once took with his father for weekend fishing trips. At the familiar bend in the road, Eli hesitated briefly. Then he reached for his grandmother's hand. "I miss Dad," he said softly, "but I'm not sad anymore, because I know he would have loved Max." Agnes gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Your father would be very, very proud." When they reached the riverbank, they stopped at the exact spot where Eli had once leapt into the water to save Max. Now, instead of roaring currents, the river was calm, a mirror reflecting the sparkling sky above. Eli sat down. Max laid beside him, her body relaxed, and Max Jr. So, the black-furred pup with a white streak on his chest ran wild in the grass, a little branch in his mouth like a trophy he couldn't wait to show off. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything around him whispered it for him. "You did it. You saved a soul and found your own." Agnes spread the picnic blanket and opened the basket. But Eli only took a few bites of bread before returning to Max's side, lying down beside her, one hand resting on her back, just like he used to during those cold winter nights. "We're a family," he murmured, speaking to the breeze. Max gave his hand a gentle lick, and Max Jr. came bounding over, wriggling between them like a sleepy toddler, desperate for a warm place to nap. Eli looked at his grandmother and smiled. Not a hesitant smile, not a guarded one, but a real smile, full and free. "No one's taking Max from us anymore, right, Grandma?" Agnes sat down beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. She looked out at the slow-moving river and thought of all they had survived, the grief, the fear, the nights filled with nothing but broken breaths, and the cold hug of a worn-out teddy bear. "No, Eli," she whispered. "No one will take her from us now. We kept her with love." They stayed like that until evening. The sun sank low, casting the river in fiery streaks of orange and gold. But to Agnes, it was the most beautiful light she'd ever seen, because it lit up three silhouettes: a boy, a dog reborn from hell, and a new life born from trust and bravery. A family. Not perfect, not complete, but real. By the time they walked the forest path home, Max Jr. led the way. Max trotted beside Eli, and Agnes followed behind her heartlight, as if every winter ever buried in her chest had finally melted away.